Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to give it just one more minute for more people to go ahead and come into the webinar, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. All right, it looks like we've got a good critical mass that have made their way into the webinar, so let's get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Brenda Smeaton, and I am the legal director of the Georgia Justice Project. And we're here today to talk about getting a pardon in Georgia as a path to opportunity and record clearing. We did a pardon webinar a couple of years ago, but there have been some big changes since then, so we wanted to update you. First, the process to apply for a pardon has changed, with the biggest change being a move to an entirely electronic application. Second big change is that there's been a change in what a pardon can do for you. Since 2021, if you get a pardon, it may be a path to seal the record of the pardoned felony conviction. We're going to go into all of that, talk about all that today, and go into even more detail in part 2. So I know that we have attorneys and advocates and workforce providers watching today. We are really happy that you are here, but I also want to give a special welcome if you are watching because you or someone that you care about has a felony conviction on your record. Perhaps your record has made it difficult for you to find a job or get the job that you really want, or even find a safe place to live. So we designed this webinar for you, and we hope that it will be helpful. We also just want to start by saying that a pardon is a certificate that says you were rehabilitated in the eyes of the state of Georgia. We know, and hopefully you know as well, that you don't need a certificate to show your value or dignity or potential. Those things exist within you now, regardless of whether you get a pardon or not. But we also know that having a record imposes real barriers and that a pardon may be a tool to access opportunity. So let's go over what we are going to cover in this two-part webinar. All right. So today we are going to talk about what a pardon really is and does for you and who is eligible to apply. We will give an overview of the application process and talk about how you can tell your story in the application and beyond. On October 22nd, join us for a deeper dive and to hear from a longtime investigator for the State Board of Pardons and Paroles, and that's the agency that reviews and decides applications. After today, we will send you a link to this video and information about registering for part 2 if you haven't yet. And then by the end of October, we are going to share what we hope will be a helpful toolkit to guide you through the process of applying for a pardon. So just some housekeeping. If you have questions as we go along today, please use the Q&A feature instead of the chat. We have a large group today. We will try to answer your questions as we go along through Q&A or as we go along in the presentation. And hopefully at the end, we will have a few minutes to go through some of your questions as well. Also, just a reminder, please do not share details about your record or your cases in the Q&A. Don't share personal information. We can't give you legal advice about your legal situation through the webinar. So please focus your questions as general questions about pardons. And then one last thing is that we are presenting this material in October of 2025, and it reflects our current understanding of the pardon process and criteria, but those things can always change. So when you're applying for a pardon, always check the website for the State Board of Pardons and Paroles to see if there's any updates. All right, before we launch in, I want to tell you a little bit about Georgia Justice Project. So we were founded almost 40 years ago. Next year will be 40 years. And we were founded with a belief in the worth and potential of every person who's been impacted by the criminal legal system, and with an understanding that the system must change for people and communities to thrive and be safe. We are a nonprofit legal services organization that represents people who can't afford an attorney. Our work is organized around two concrete objectives. The first one is reducing correctional control in Georgia. So a person's under correctional control while they are in jail or prison or on probation or parole. If you weren't aware, Georgia has the highest rate of correctional control in the country, unfortunately, by far. Our second objective is reducing barriers to reentry, and we address both of these goals through a combination of direct legal representation, education, and outreach and advocacy work as well. On the direct services side, we work at nearly every stage of the criminal legal system. Our attorneys represent individuals with pending charges, as well as those with a decades-old record and many steps in between. And then we take what we learn from working with our clients and listening to your stories, and we propose and advocate to change laws and policies to make systemic change. On the next slide is more about our criminal records work, which is the team that you're hearing from today. So you are going to hear from Paige, Henry, and Cooper in a bit, who are part of the records team, and they assist people who have an arrest or conviction record. They, along with the rest of the team, do this in a number of ways, representing people who apply for services through our office. They also operate 3 second chance desks around the state in Cobb County, Athens, Clarke County, and in the Augusta Judicial Circuit. Also, they assist by partnering with local communities and prosecutors to hold record clearing events all around the state. And of course, we assist with pardons, and we do that mostly through a new clinic that we started a couple of years ago that's run by our pro bono team. You should know that although our records team is amazing, they're a very small team, and over 4.5 million people have a Georgia criminal history, and over 650,000 people have a felony conviction. So there's just no way that we can help everyone. That's why we focus a lot of our time on providing education and self-help resources, and we're doing more of that. One of our most popular resources is our virtual First Fridays presentation, which covers all record clearing options in Georgia. And you can sign up for that on our website at gjp.org, and I think someone will probably drop a link to it as well. But today we have a narrow focus, which is pardons. Just a couple of general things. We want to make sure that you understand that you do not need an attorney to apply for a pardon, so that we do hope that you will feel empowered to apply for one on your own. Also, I mentioned this a minute ago, one of the reasons we're here today is because a lot of our policy advocacy at the state level has focused on changing state law to allow more people to clear their records, including some people that get a pardon. Okay. A few more minutes with me, we're going to get into some nuts and bolts about record clearing in Georgia. All right, jumping into the details to help you get a better understanding of how a pardon works and the power of a pardon since the 2021 change in the law, let's talk briefly about record clearing. So a lot of us, when we're looking to clean up our record, we Google, like, how do I get an expungement? Expungement is the word that we know for record clearing. But in Georgia, we actually don't have a process called expungement. What we do have in Georgia is a 2-step process called restriction and sealing. And together, these 2 steps keep records private for most purposes, which can help with jobs and housing and other opportunities. So let's look a little bit more closely at that process. So the first step, like I said, is called restriction, which does what it says. Basically restricts access to who can see your record. After restriction, after getting a record restricted, most people in agencies other than law enforcement can't see your record if they're looking at an official government background check. Law enforcement can always see records in Georgia, even if they are restricted. So in Georgia, the Georgia Crime Information Center is the agency that maintains official backgrounds. You may have heard of a GCIC report, like go to a law enforcement agency, get your GCIC report. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So every state has an agency like GCIC that collects criminal record information from law enforcement and courts, and then they all feed into the national database that's run by the FBI, which sometimes is called the NCIC. So that's step 1, is dealing with that official record. Second step is sealing your restricted record. So after a record is restricted, you can ask the court that handled your case to seal the physical and electronic records of your case. So you ask the court to do this by filing a motion or a petition. If the judge agrees to seal your case, then it is no longer public record, and private background check companies can't report the information. So both of these steps, restriction and sealing, are necessary to prevent employers or landlords or others from seeing your record. Again, you can learn more at our First Friday presentation about what records can be restricted and sealed, but just very briefly, it includes almost all dismissed charges, charges that didn't result in a conviction, many misdemeanor convictions, and now some pardoned felony convictions. So one aside we want to make here that we always want to remind folks is that you don't have to restrict and seal your record or get a pardon to be able to vote in Georgia. So in Georgia, if you otherwise meet the requirements to vote, you can vote as long as you are not currently serving a sentence for a felony conviction. So if you were convicted of a felony, but you have completed your sentence, so you're done with your sentence, you're done with probation or parole, incarceration, you can vote. If you are on first offender or conditional discharge probation, even before you complete it, as long as you haven't been revoked, you can vote, because those are not convictions unless your status has been revoked. But if you did have a felony conviction, we want to make sure you hear this. When your sentence is complete, you can vote. So if you're here because you want a pardon to vote, while a pardon is useful in other ways, you do not need a pardon to vote. But also, we just want to remind you that you do need to re-register after you've completed your sentence. All right, so let's get into pardons. I mentioned before that when you get a pardon, you get a certificate, which is an order of official forgiveness from the state of Georgia. They are granted by the State Board of Pardons and Paroles, and that board has 5 members who are appointed by the governor. In some states, it's the governor that grants pardons, but here it's that board. About 400 to 450 pardons historically have been granted each year. There are a few different kinds of relief that are granted by the board in the pardon context, and we're going to talk about those in a minute. But pardons are usually for felony convictions. You can apply for a pardon for any offense. You can apply for multiple felony convictions at the same time. Like I said before, you don't need an attorney. And importantly, there is no cost to apply. All right, so how can a pardon help me? A pardon can be a useful tool in several different ways. While getting a pardon in and of itself doesn't clear or seal your record, after you receive the pardon, you can ask the court to seal the record of your conviction. So that's the change that happened in 2021. Now, there are exceptions. While you can get a pardon for any offense, and that certificate of rehabilitation will be useful, if you were convicted of a serious violent felony or a serious sex offense, then the conviction is not then eligible for sealing. So our team's going to drop a link in the chat to a flyer that lists what those excluded offenses are. But like I said, even in the absence of sealing, pardons can have great value for you. So another benefit of a pardon is that it restores the civil rights that are lost when you were convicted of a felony in Georgia. And these include the right to serve on a jury, be a notary, hold public office, and in some cases, a pardon can restore your right to carry a firearm. Also, many people want pardon because it can provide a sense of closure and a recognition that all you have done to move on from your past. And then lastly, probably the majority of our clients come to us because they want a pardon to improve their job prospects. So to get a job or to get a better job. So that certificate of rehabilitation that you get, it may reassure your employer that you have moved on from your past. Also, a pardon provides legal protections for employers around liability. So even though this is very uncommon, if something happens, an employer might be worried, well, am I going to get sued because I hired somebody with a record? But if an employer hires somebody that has received a pardon, then the employer has a presumption if there ever is a lawsuit, that they exercised care in screening you. And then the one final topic that I want to go through before I hand it over is some instances where you do not need a pardon. So you do not need a pardon, well, if you weren't convicted. So pardons are not for non-convictions. If you have a felony charge on your record, but you were not convicted of it, then you do not need a pardon. You may need some other form of relief, such as restriction and sealing. And remember, if you had first offender or conditional discharge and successfully completed your sentence, then you do not need a pardon, although you still may need some other relief, restriction and sealing of those cases. So again, please come to First Fridays to learn more. Also, on the next slide, there are some instances where you may not need a pardon. So if even if you were convicted of a felony or multiple felonies, a pardon might not be the best path for you in these situations. First, if you were convicted because you were the victim of sex or labor trafficking, then there is a different and even more powerful legal remedy under Georgia law that can lead to actually vacating your convictions. So if you have any concern, you think this might be you, or you want to learn more, look at the information on our website and reach out to us or to another attorney. Another situation where a pardon may not be needed is if you have only one felony conviction on your record and you never used first offender. It was an eligible offense, but you were not informed about first offender, and so you weren't able to take advantage of it. And now I want to turn it over to my amazing colleague, Paige Jan, who is the supervising attorney of our records team, to dive deeper.
Great. Thank you so much, Brenda. Good afternoon, everyone. Brenda just shared with you all a great overview of the importance of pardons in Georgia. Because pardons are even more powerful today, we always recommend that folks apply for a pardon if they're eligible. With that, I'll be jumping next into giving an overview of pardon eligibility. In other words, how do you know if you can apply for a pardon now? The goal for this is for you to know at the end of this section, am I eligible right now to apply for a pardon? Or when will I be eligible in the future? I will also spend some time towards the end giving you a rough timeline of the pardon process to give you an idea of what it looks like from start to finish and about how long it takes. Now, before we focus entirely on pardons, I wanted to mention different forms of relief offered by the State Board of Pardon and Parole. You will see these on the pardon application. These different forms of relief get at different rights that are lost or consequences that are suffered because of a felony conviction. First, restoration of civil and political rights. Brenda already mentioned this a bit, but when you are convicted of a felony in Georgia, you lose certain civil rights, specifically the right to serve on a jury, become a notary, run for office. The board can restore these rights. The second and third bullet points on this slide speak to a pardon or a restoration of civil and political rights, in addition to a request for firearm rights restoration. You also lose the right to have firearms in Georgia due to a felony conviction. The board can restore those rights too. One side note here, the board can restore firearm rights for out-of-state convictions. I will say that firearm rights, though, are not our focus today. We would recommend you check out the State Board of Pardon and Parole website for more information. It's often helpful to speak with an attorney also who specializes in firearm rights issues when that's your primary goal. The fourth kind of relief is a separate pardon process for convictions that result in someone being placed on the sexual offense registry. The eligibility and process are different, and they're going to be very different from what we talk about today. In fact, we're not going to focus too much on that, but we are going to drop in the chat a handout where we summarize the differences and the eligibility requirements for pursuing a pardon for an offense that may have placed someone on the sexual offense registry. Fifth and finally, the board grants pardons for misdemeanor convictions in very specific instances. The pardon application lists them out, but we're going to take some time later on to talk about that later in this section. This training today is going to be focusing on pardons for Georgia felony convictions. A pardon restores the civil and political rights that we already mentioned, and it provides the order of forgiveness from Georgia. This is also the relief that opens the door to restriction and sealing for certain eligible pardon offenses that Brenda mentioned just a slide ago. We are focusing here because this is the relief that people reaching out to us most often need to access the employment and housing opportunities that they deserve. Now, turning to pardons, or what we sometimes call a general pardon, there are 5 main questions to ask yourself or to focus on to determine if you are eligible for a pardon. The slides that follow are going to dig into each of these 5 questions deeper, but let's start with a preview. First, am I concerned about a Georgia felony conviction? The emphasis here is on Georgia and felony conviction. Second, has it been 5 years since my very last sentence for any case? Sentence is broad here, and we're going to talk more about what that means. Third, during the past 5 years, have you lived a law-abiding life? This is a standard that has been created by the board, and I will explain more about what it means soon. Fourth, for the conviction I'm asking for a pardon, did I pay fines and restitution? And fifth and finally, are all of my cases closed out, meaning nothing is pending? If the answer is yes to all of these questions, great news, you may be eligible for a pardon. Now let's look at each of these 5 questions a bit closer. First, the State Board of Pardon and Parole typically grants pardons for just felony Georgia convictions. Although this is our focus, felony convictions, please note that we will have a slide later where we talk about when and how you can apply for a pardon for a misdemeanor conviction in limited instances. But here, now, our focus is Georgia felony convictions. Now, how do I know if I have a felony conviction on my record? Felony convictions are typically cases where you pled guilty or were found guilty for a charge which carried a sentence of more than a year. Entering a NOLO or no contest plea to a felony offense would also be a felony conviction in this context. For example, let's say I went to trial and was found guilty of criminal damage to property and received a 3-year sentence. This is a felony conviction on my record. Couple of reminders here, and some of these are kind of hitting again the things that Brenda mentioned. You do not need a pardon if your case was resolved as a non-conviction, like a dismissal, an acquittal, and not presented to grand jury. This process for a pardon is just for convictions. Also, a successfully completed first offender and conditional discharge sentence is not a conviction. First offender and conditional discharge are statutes or laws in Georgia that are intended to keep a conviction off your record to begin with. If you are sentenced under first offender or conditional discharge and you successfully completed your sentence, meaning the judge never took it away, this case is not a conviction on your record and you don't need a pardon for it. Now, if you're not sure if your case or any cases were resolved as a felony conviction or not, what can you do? Stay tuned because we will discuss later how you can get a copy of your criminal history as well as the court documents needed to confirm the outcome of the case. Additionally, you can ask for a pardon for more than one felony conviction on your record. Even if you had, say, 3 different cases that ended in felony convictions several years apart, you only need to submit one pardon application. If the board grants the pardon, it will attach to all Georgia felony convictions. And please know you can only apply for a pardon for a Georgia conviction. Here, an emphasis on Georgia, meaning the case had to be prosecuted by the state of Georgia and within one of Georgia's 159 counties. The process cannot help, the pardon process cannot help with out-of-state history, unfortunately, or federal convictions. Many states have their own record clearing options. So if you have history that falls outside of Georgia, take a look online and see if there's a nonprofit like ours that can help with record clearing. And if it's a federal conviction, drop us a note in the chat and we can send information about the Department of Justice and the presidential pardon process. But please know the presidential process is a different process. It is for federal convictions only. And today we're just talking about Georgia felony convictions. Right, next, to be eligible for a pardon, you must have finished all sentences for at least 5 years before you can apply. What does that exactly look like? This doesn't just mean 5 years since your felony conviction. It means prior to turning in the pardon, have you finished all sentences for all cases for the past 5 years? The board will run a national history when you turn in your application, and they will see and consider Georgia and out-of-state history for this waiting period. This even includes any sentence where you were on non-reporting, unsupervised, or even phone and mail reporting. These still count as being under sentence. Now, if you aren't sure or can't remember when you finished your last sentence, your sentence documents from your cases will tell you how long the sentence lasted. Another option is to ask probation to give you a certificate of sentence completion, saying when you have officially finished your sentence. Our best recommendation here is to get a copy of your official criminal history report and make sure that you can count 5 years from the end of any sentence appearing on it. We will share later in this training how you can get this report and how to read it to confirm. One final note here that points out one of the big differences in the pardon process if someone is currently on the sexual offense registry. The waiting period is extended to 10 years. Again, there are other requirements and differences. Please check out the board's website or even our one-pager to note those differences. A quick note of good news for anyone that's still under felony probation supervision, right? We just talked about a 5-year waiting period. What can you do if you're still under probation supervision? So even though you may not be eligible for a pardon yet, there is a process in Georgia to terminate felony probation early so you can start the 5-year clock running sooner. This applies to all offenses. There are no excluded offenses. Georgia law now says if you have already served 3 years under probation supervision without any new arrests, besides non-serious traffic offenses, have paid all restitution if you had any, and have had no revocations in the past 24 months. If those are all true, then you're eligible to have your probation terminated early. If you think you may qualify for early termination, contact your probation officer today to get that conversation going. We're going to drop in the chat more resources for early termination from felony probation. All right, jumping back to pardon eligibility. Let's recap what we know up until this point. In order to apply for a pardon, you must have a Georgia felony conviction. You must have finished all sentences for 5 years. What else? During the 5-year waiting period, the board requires that you lived a law-abiding life. This is language again used by the board. It means no new arrests or convictions during that 5-year time frame. We've included on this slide some things that can happen that do not affect or push out the 5-year waiting period that we want you to know about. First, if you have a traffic offense that you are not arrested for and that does not appear on your criminal history, this won't affect the 5-year waiting period. Or if you have a new arrest or case and it was completely dismissed and restricted, remember this was what Brenda was mentioning earlier about limiting from view on your official criminal history report. If it's been dismissed and restricted, this would not affect the waiting period either. Here's an example. Let's say I have 2 prior felony convictions and I finished my very last sentence in 2010. I then had a stop sign ticket in 2022. Am I still eligible for a pardon? Yes. Stop sign violations are minor traffic offenses. They do not appear on criminal history, and they do not affect the waiting period whatsoever. Now let's change the facts a bit. Let's say instead of getting a ticket for a stop sign, I'm arrested for driving while license suspended, a traffic, though misdemeanor conviction in Georgia. And let's say this happens in 2022. I go to court, I enter a guilty plea, and I finish my probation and fines in 2023. Am I eligible for a pardon now? No, not yet. I would need to wait until 2028 to apply for a pardon. How did I get here? 5 years from finishing my sentence in 2023 would push my eligibility out to 2028. Now, waiting 5 years is a bright line eligibility rule, but we will discuss later the limited instances when you can ask the board to waive this waiting period. All right, last 2 eligibility pieces. Payment of fines and restitution. It's a very simple rule here. Obligations that are tied to the sentence end when your sentence ends. whether your sentence ends due to early termination or just because the case expires. For restitution, though, which is money paid to the named victim, please know this doesn't mean it just gets wiped out. It just means that it's no longer a requirement of the criminal case. The main point here is that neither fines nor restitution affect your pardon eligibility if your sentence is complete. Second, are all cases closed? In other words, no pending cases, no pending charges. You can't have open cases. You can't have even open traffic cases like driving while license suspended if it's appearing on your criminal history. Please know when we're talking about pending cases, this also includes dead dockets. Dead dockets are inactive, but technically pending cases. Often a case is put in dead docket status to complete a condition or in place of a dismissal. You must clear, and here we mean get dismissed, all dead dockets. The board will not process your application with any dead dockets on your record. These are quite common in Fulton County, and it helps to speak with an attorney to figure out the best and safest way to clear dead dockets since they're technically pending cases. Now, if you have answered yes to all these questions, congratulations. You may be eligible for a pardon. And a reminder, you can get a pardon for any offense. Once you do, certain pardon offenses can then be restricted and sealed or cleared from your record. Now, just a reminder, we will be sending out these slides. So if you need at any point to go back and get certain documents to confirm and double check your eligibility, you'll have these as a reference. Now, before we talk about an overview of the pardon process, I wanted to touch on two exceptions to the board's bright line eligibility rules. The big takeaways here, the big things to take away, are to know that they exist, that you need specific documents to prove that you meet the exceptions, that they are granted in very limited instances, and it is ultimately in the discretion of the board to grant them. First, waiver of the 5-year waiting period. Even though the default requirement is to wait 5 years from your last sentence to apply for a pardon, you can ask the board to waive this period if you can show that waiting the 5 years would delay you in your chosen profession. You need to submit 3 letters of reference from non-family members. You also need documentation from a current or potential employer about the need. Here's another example. Let's say I'm a nurse and I finished my very last sentence for a felony conviction 3 years ago. I recently received a job offer from a private medical practice that wants to hire me right now, but their HR is concerned about my record and would like me to clear it by getting a pardon before I can start with them in the next few months. They can't hold the position any longer. Waiting until I hit 5 years for my pardon eligibility would prevent me from getting this job in my chosen profession, here, healthcare. I would need the employer to write me a letter showing this need for me to then include it with my pardon application. Next, requesting a pardon for a misdemeanor conviction. Even though pardons are typically granted for felony convictions, the board does recognize that certain instances may require the need for a pardon for a misdemeanor conviction. Now, there is a limited list, which we've listed on this slide. It's a limited list of reasons that you can select on the pardon application. You must submit documents showing that you need it for one of these specific reasons. Another example, if I'm a truck driver who has contracts in Canada, but I cannot enter due to a misdemeanor conviction, or maybe I can't even get into an educational program because of a misdemeanor conviction, I would need to submit something in writing, like screening policies from the school or Canada, to show this. Just a note, if you get a pardon for a misdemeanor conviction, you'll also be able to restrict and seal it like a pardoned felony conviction. This can become incredibly helpful for certain misdemeanors that may not otherwise be eligible. The goal for both of these exceptions is specific documentation, showing how you qualify. And if you qualify, you must upload and include the information with your pardon application. We encourage you to check out the pardon application for more details. All right, now that you know if you can submit a pardon, what does the process look like? We've included on this slide an overview of the process and the typical steps it takes. from getting started all the way through to the board's decision. Step 1. This includes something like today, gathering the knowledge and the information that you will need to start the application process. My colleague Henry is going to join in a moment to talk through this step and exactly what you need to get. Step 2. The entire application process is online. Create a free account and complete the application. We will drop in the chat the application link so you all can check it out for yourselves. Please, please remember, the pardon application is a process, and we recommend that you approach it that way. You can save your work and complete it over time. You do not want to rush through it. It is a discretionary process, and you must wait 2 years to reapply if the board says no. The board also doesn't explain the reason for a no, and because of this, you want to make sure it is the strongest version possible of the application before you hit the submit button. This is why we are dedicating the entire part of our part 2 of this training to giving guidance and pointers on how to fill out the application to give yourself the best chance. Step 3. Once you hit submit on your pardon application, the board then begins their investigation. They assign a DCS or felony probation officer to review and confirm the information that you included in the application. The district attorney and victim are sometimes notified for certain offenses. You are waiting during this time frame, but you stay ready and in contact should the board need any other information from you. Sometimes they reach back out and ask for another document before they can keep processing your application, and you want to be ready to do so. Step 4, DCS or probation officer schedules an in-person visit for an interview in Georgia. Even if you live out of state, it must happen in Georgia. You will need to schedule a time in a county in Georgia for the interview. More information to come in part 2 of this training about the interview process, but please know it is a required part no matter what form of relief you're requesting. Step 5. The pardon process can take approximately 6 to 8 months after you hit submit. Once that time has passed, the board will issue a decision. If it is granted, you get a certificate of forgiveness from the state of Georgia, and it restores those civil and political rights that we talked about, right? And the right to sit for a jury, run for office, become a notary. Those things get restored through this process. And if it's an eligible pardon offense, you then are immediately eligible to ask the original court to restrict and seal the pardon offense. Remember, all are eligible to be restricted and sealed except for serious violent or sexual offenses. If the pardon is denied, there is no way to appeal, unfortunately, and you must wait 2 years to reapply. Now that you all are experts on eligibility in the process, I'm going to pass it over to Henry to give a closer look at step 1 and the documents that you can start gathering right now.
Thank you, Paige. I'm Henry, and let's talk about getting the legal documents you need to submit with your pardon application. You will specifically need a GCIC, Georgia Crime and Information Center, Code U, Criminal History Report, and certified final dispositions for convictions we want pardoned, and time expired restricted cycles on that GCIC Code U Criminal History Report. Now, this may sound like a garble of letters, but don't worry. First, we will go into detail on what a GCIC Code U is, why you need it, and how to get it. Then, I will explain how to read your GCIC Code U criminal history so you know what court documents you need. Then, we will go over how to get those court documents. Let's start with understanding and getting your GCIC Code U criminal history. Your GCIC is your official Georgia record based on your fingerprint data gathered at arrest. This document is always the starting place for record clearing. It will show you the details of every arrest you've ever had in Georgia, including what court cases and court decisions stemmed from those arrests. A purpose code U is unique to you and only for your eyes. Because of this, it will show things that have already been restricted, which you will see listed on the report. But please don't be alarmed. Most employers and housing providers would not see this version because only you can request a Purpose Code U. However, you will always want to start with a GCIC Code U report so you can make sure everything appears correctly. And also because this GCIC report will act as your guide when seeking court records for cases you want pardoned and figuring out if you have any time expired restricted cycles. Getting a copy of this report is actually quite simple. Police precincts and sheriff's office across the state of Georgia can run the report for you. You can go to your local police department or sheriff's office with a copy of your government ID, about $25 so you can pay the fee, and ask for a GCIC Purpose Code U report. Some precincts may call it something a little different, like a personal copy, but you want to make sure you get the one that has every single arrest and case from Georgia on your record, even ones that might already be restricted and sealed. Now that you know what a GCIC Code U is and how to get one, let's talk about reading it correctly. You will look through your GCIC Code U specifically to find the cases that you want pardoned, those felony convictions, and cycles that say time expired restricted. For both instances, you're going to need to get court dispositions to provide in your application. However, before we talk about dispositions, let's talk more about that GCIC cycle I just mentioned. So cycles on a GCIC consist of the arrest information from an arrest, a court disposition section showing what happened in the court, and a sentencing section. The first section of a GCIC cycle is always the arrest section, which is pictured on screen now. It shows you the arrest date, the arresting agency, and which charges you were arrested for. Again, every GCIC cycle starts with the arrest information. Now let's talk about that court disposition section. The court disposition section is, as it's named, shows you what happened in court, and it is pictured on screen now. This portion of the GCIC cycle would show you your felony convictions. You would know it's a conviction because it says guilty, convicted, adjudicated in all caps below the charge listed. All of these words tell you the case resulted in a conviction. You can also see the severity of the conviction, whether it was a felony or a misdemeanor. Now, if you see unknown in the severity section, and you see it was tried in Superior Court, but you're not sure if it's a felony, you should also add that case to your court document list in case it's a felony conviction. So, as you get your GCIC and go through it, write down the court, the arrest date, and the charges for each felony conviction you see. Those are some of the cases, most of the cases, you are going to need to go to a court and ask for copies of the final disposition to give in your pardon application. But before we get to requesting those dispositions, let's cover the other documents, or let's cover finding the other documents you need to find based on your GCIC. So you have that felony information. Let's go back to that arrest section of the GCIC cycle and discuss how to spot time expired restriction. Fairly simple. If you see time expired restriction in all caps, this is highlighted on screen, under the charges in the arrest section of a GCIC cycle, that means that cycle is time expired restricted. Time expired restriction simply means that the court where your case was resolved failed to send over the paperwork to the Georgia Crime and Information Center about how the case was resolved. For these cases, like those felony convictions, you will need to request a copy of your final disposition from the appropriate court to provide in the pardon application. Now that you know how to build your list of felony convictions and time expired restricted cycles, let's dive into asking the court for certified copies of your final dispositions. You will need, again, certified copies of final dispositions for felony cases on your GCIC and time expired restricted cycles. A final disposition is just the formal document from the court saying how the case was resolved. For felony convictions, you can get that certified disposition by contacting the superior court clerk in the court where the case was tried. Let's say your GCIC shows that you have a felony conviction from Cobb County Superior Court. We know that felony cases are tried in Superior Court. Our GCIC says Cobb County Superior Court, and the county court system on your GCIC is going to be the county court system you need to contact in real life. In this example, you would call or visit the Cobb County Superior Court clerk and tell them you need a certified disposition for your case. Then you would give them the name, date of birth, case number if you can see it, and the charges from the case that are printed on your GCIC. With that information, the court clerk can pull up the case, print the disposition documents, certify them, and then sell them to you for a $5 to $7 fee. Or if you're on the phone, they can tell you how to mail a money order and written request for the documents so you can get those documents mailed to you. I said certified dispositions, and that's what the board requires. Certified disposition has a seal on them from the court, and you can get a certified disposition by just asking for them. So make sure when you're asking for that disposition, you ask for a certified copy. Also, if you're asking for a pardon for a violent offense conviction, you will need a copy of the indictment. Getting the indictment is as simple as asking for the disposition. You can literally say, may I get a certified copy of my disposition and the indictment for this case? Now, for time expired restricted cycles, you want to first see if the court system in the county where you were arrested has an online search. You can do this by Googling the county court system criminal records case search. Now, an online search is helpful because it lets you search your name and court records and see if there is a case from the same time as your time expired arrest and with the same charges. If you find a case matching the arrest information, that case probably stemmed from the time expired restricted cycle, and you would then give that case number to the court and ask for the disposition like you would for a felony conviction. Let's say you can't find the case online, so you just have the arresting agency, the date of the arrest, and the charges. The charge is a misdemeanor severity. You should contact state court first. If they are felony severity, contact superior court. And if they're unknown, start with either. The best way to find a time expired restricted document is trial and error. You just know the county where the case might be because you know where you got arrested, but you don't know where it ended up in the court system. The best way to find that out is patiently calling court clerks for state court, superior court, magistrate, and municipal court, giving them the arrest information and just asking if they have a case that matches the charges. That will tell you which court levels do not have the case and ultimately lead you to the one that does. So if one clerk doesn't have the case or tells you you're not in the right place, be patient, don't worry, cross that option off, and reach out to the other court clerks for the other levels of the system. Now, if you have trouble locating court documents, or you think you may have court documents already that match the certified disposition, check out the toolkit we're going to send to you for tips on how to get hard to find documents and knowing what a disposition and court documents look like and are. Now, I'm going to pass this to my colleague Cooper, who will explain what personal information to gather and help you prepare to tell your story. And please put any document request questions in the Q&A box so I can answer them.
Thanks so much, Henry. I'm Cooper Ulrich. I'm a staff attorney, as you already heard, on the records team. And Henry just let you know all the details you need about the court documents that you're going to need. I'm now going to talk about some other documents you're going to need for the application that includes personal information. Some of the documents are going to be required by the application. Some are not going to be required, but in our expertise and experience doing pardons, we think that they're really, really helpful and essential for getting the outcome you want. Let's dive in. So first, information that is required that you will need to gather and share on your application, in addition, of course, to the court documents Henry just talked about. I'm not going to go into super detail about each of these because I want to remind y'all that there's a second part to this training, and you've heard a lot at a high level, but you're going to hear a lot more detail in that second part about how to fill out your application. They're really going to walk you through step by step. And so once this is done, you've gotten a lot of info, but you got to come back for the second one to make sure you get the rest. So at a high level, you're going to need your addresses for the past 10 years. Please be mindful that you should be as accurate and as detailed as possible. You may have gaps in memory. You might, between now and the next training, I would recommend, trying to fill those gaps. Maybe you know the name of the apartment complex, but you don't know the address. Try Googling it. Or you lived with a friend. They might have the information. When were we there? Was it 2022 or was it 2021? So this can be a good period of time between now and the next training to try to get this information. Phone numbers, supervisor's name for employers, since you've completed your sentence, name of your high school or any schools or colleges you've attended. One thing you absolutely need is the dates that you attended high school, whether or not you completed it. Dates of marriages and divorces, that includes legal marriages, not common law marriages. Names and ages of your children, as well as any children that live with you, even if they're not your biological or adopted children. Military discharge info, for those of you who know, DD Form 214. Information about substance abuse or mental health treatment. If you were in an inpatient or outpatient facility and you know that there are records that might be helpful, this might be a good opportunity to go gather those. Again, you're not submitting anything till the next training, but just to kind of start to be thinking what you might need. Information about debts that are in default, meaning that you still owe or that were not paid, and any information about civil lawsuits that you were a party to. This is information you can usually get from the civil court clerk if you don't have it. Okay, so that's what is required, all right? You're gonna need that information. This list is what we recommend, and it's a strong recommendation. We find that when you just do the minimum, the bare minimum, that it may not allow you to stand out, and we want you to stand out. So the first thing we recommend are photos of you and your family. The purpose of this, which is also I'm going to talk about in the next section about storytelling, the purpose of this is to humanize you. The board receives lots of applications. They see names, they see a record, right? I like to say your record always tells its own story. We're going to talk in a minute about how you tell your story instead of letting your record tell it for you. But the photo is part of that. The photo is going to, especially if it includes your loved ones. So you with your kids, if you're comfortable, or you with family members that shows you as a person in relationships, that lets the board know this is who our decision will impact, that will motivate them to want to help you, okay? Just a quick note, this is probably obvious, but try to not include photos of what looks like partying or drinking. We just want the focus to be on you and your family. Letters of recommendation. I cannot overemphasize how important letters of recommendation can be for your pardon application from non-family members. So at this juncture, we're not saying go out and get them right now. But what we are saying is start thinking about who might be good to write these. This is an opportunity to give someone else's evidence that what you're saying is true, right? You're going to talk and tell your own story in your pardon application, but having someone else say it again from their perspective is really, really powerful. So again, you don't have to go get the letters now. We're going to explain in part 2 what they should say, what formats we recommend. But focus on who would be good to ask them, approaching them, asking if it's something they'd be willing to do. I suggest approaching people with gratitude and telling them what an impact they've had on your life and that you think their words would go a long way in this process. So really kind of empowering them to say, I think you could have a big impact if you could help me with this, and let them know. Maybe they might express concern, say, I don't know what to write, or I don't know how to do this. I've never done anything like this before. Just letting them know, I'm going to have another training. I'm going to get more details about what you need, but I will help you in this process. If you need me to make some suggestions, you can really empower the folks who are asking. Okay, certificates and diplomas. We want to focus on things that came after your record that you're trying to have pardoned. All right. So things you're proud of. This can include a photograph of your certificate or your diploma. You don't need a transcript unless you're still in school. A transcript could be helpful, but taking a photo is fine, or even a letter from a professor, which could kind of overlap with the letters of recommendation, but just the actual thing itself of the certificate and diploma that you're proud of. And again, you want to focus on things that occurred after the record. And lastly, evidence that the conviction is harming you. Some of you may have this, some of you may not. But what might be an example of this? Let's say you applied for a job. Paige mentioned this a little bit in the misdemeanor exception section, but this can be powerful with the felonies as well if you have it. So let's say you've applied for jobs or housing for the last couple of years, and you have the rejection letter that specifically says it's this conviction that's the problem, right? Or they gave you the letter and they attached the printout of your background check. That can be really helpful to include and mention, I keep getting this kind of rejection. And that will demonstrate for the board that you're not just saying it's harming you, but it in fact is. It's not required again, but it can be helpful if you have it. Okay. This next topic is something near and dear to my heart. In record clearing in general, and specifically in pardons. I believe that the way you talk about your life and your story and your experience in the criminal legal system and how you've grown since then can be the single most important thing in persuading the board to give you the outcome you're wanting, which is a pardon. The application for the pardon asks you in a few different places to write about you and your life. None of these sections, I want to just tell you this, okay? None of these sections is titled, tell us your story or your story, okay? That's our language. Because we believe that each of those sections that you're being asked to talk about yourself is an opportunity to tell the pardon board about yourself and your story and why they should give you a pardon, okay? This is something you're going to do in the background, kind of figure out, how do I want to talk about my life and my story and my growth since my record that will then translate into each of these sections where you're writing. We want you to be persuasive, and we're going to give you some suggestions for how to think about and share your own story in the most persuasive way possible. I do want to give a little disclaimer here before I dive in. There are so many people on this call. Each of you have different life experiences and different experiences with your case and the criminal legal system. Okay, so we're talking about how to tell your story, but we don't know you and we don't know your story. So I just want to acknowledge something, which is some folks on this call might feel that they made mistakes that led to their cases and their criminal legal involvement. They may have regrets about some of the choices that they made or the behaviors that they engaged in. For those folks, those feelings can make it really difficult to talk about your past or to think about it or to tell your story. So that may be a challenge. For others of you on this call, and for some of you, both of these might be true. For others of you on this call, maybe you were pressured by someone to take a plea to something that you really feel you didn't do. Maybe you were treated more harshly, or you feel that you were treated more harshly because of the color of your skin, because of racism. Maybe someone lied and accused you of something that wasn't true, but you didn't have the resources to hire an attorney or to fight the case. I know based on my experience, and I'm just speaking as me now, Cooper, I was a defense attorney for a long time doing this work, that the criminal legal system is deeply flawed. That's putting it mildly, in my opinion. And we're here today offering you this presentation because we believe you should not be judged based on your record that was created in this flawed system. We also believe that you are more than what your criminal record says about you. Okay, that's a lot of a disclaimer. Why am I telling you this? Regardless of the reason that you got involved in the criminal legal system or your beliefs and thoughts about why you're there, the reason you're here today is because you're wanting or needing a pardon, right? Everybody's on the same page here, that you're wanting to learn about that process because you know somebody who's wanting a pardon or wanting to advocate for them. In order to get a pardon, you're going to be submitting an application to the Board of Pardons and Paroles. And many of these board members have been in some way involved in the criminal legal system. Maybe like me, they were a defense attorney. Maybe they were a judge. Maybe they were law enforcement. And our experience tells us that it is usually not helpful to try to convince people on the board that the system has mistreated you. Okay, so this is just based on what we think is going to be effective in getting you the outcome that you're wanted. Instead, what we have found to be successful are stories of redemption and rehabilitation. So the advice I'm about to give you is because our goal is to help you get the outcome that you're wanting, right? Which is a pardon. And you should hear everything with that in mind. All right. So, and the last thing I'll just say about that is that you know your story and you know what's true for you. So if anything I say here doesn't resonate and you're like, I don't want to tell it that way, it's not true, then certainly we want you to, truthfulness is the first and most important. And we're just going to let you know what we've seen be successful for our clients and for others for getting the outcome they're seeking. Let's dive in. This is pretty high level and some of it could be obvious, but we want you to first be persuasive. So you don't have to be neutral or objective. You're an advocate for yourself here, okay? So your goal is to try to convince the board to give you a pardon. So you want to be on your own team. That might seem easy, but I know for many folks, for many of us, maybe we have trauma, maybe we had folks in our life who weren't always on our team. Sometimes that can make it hard for us to be on our own team. So just remember, if you find yourself feeling critical of yourself, that's not the place from which to write a pardon application. You want to be really on your own team. You want to humanize yourself, those photographs, giving details about your life and your family and the people in your life that will help the board remember that you, like them, are a person in the world with relationships. And the last part I want to say a little bit more about, demonstrate. Okay, I like to say show, don't tell. What do I mean by that? I give an example of telling. I would be telling if I say, I've changed a lot since my cases, or I've grown a lot since my cases. That's a good sentence. That may be true. What does it mean to show that? Might sound like something like this. Since my arrest over 10 years ago, I've completed many years of treatment and therapy. I've joined and become involved in my church or mosque or local neighborhood organization. I've received 3 professional certifications. I am a reliable husband. I have become involved and committed parent to my 2 children. None of that may apply to you, right? But you get the idea, how different it sounds. And hopefully, of course, you're going to have letters of recommendation and documents that are going to show them that that's true. But this is a place where you tie it all together, where you don't say, I've grown a lot and hope that the board sees that you've grown from looking at your documents. You want to connect those dots for them and say, look, I've grown, and listen to me tell you, and you have documents to show how much I've grown. All right. I mentioned this earlier. I want to say it again. It can be difficult to tell your own story. Some folks have a clear sense of their own story. In my experience, and this includes, by the way, people outside the criminal legal system, I think this is true for humans, is that many people struggle to tell their own story for a lot of reasons. Part of your story might be painful for you to think about, and you spent a lot of time trying not to think about it, right? So you don't have practice doing it. Some of you, I mentioned this before, but might have a harsh inner critic. Maybe you're still beating yourself up or blaming yourself for moments that went wrong or that you're not proud of. For those of you who struggle with this, I have a few recommendations. It's very common to struggle with this of like, how am I going to brag on myself? I still feel so low. My first recommendation is speak to the people in your life who are your biggest fans. Okay, broadly. This could be a family member. This could be a loved one, friend. It could be a mentor, someone that was in school with you or on the job training, somebody who trained you and kind of really saw potential in you. Talk to those folks. And this requires vulnerability. What I mean by vulnerability, it's kind of that lump in your throat where you're like, oh, can I do it? Can I do this? Get some courage and have the conversation. Say, hey, if you were going to tell somebody about me or my story or what you think is so great about me, what would you say? Of course, this can come out in letters of recommendation, but this can be helpful for you to start thinking about, like, what are the things I want to brag about myself? You can talk with them. Suggestions are ask them, if you were going to tell somebody about me, what would you say? Also, if somebody knows your whole story, where you started, say, if you were going to talk about how I've grown since you first met me or since the time of my record, what would you say? That's my first recommendation. The second recommendation is to imagine looking at your life as if you were looking at your dearest, most beloved friend or person in your life. This could be a friend, a kid, but let's say your story is actually your kid's story. Just imagine for a minute. And you have to tell somebody your kid's story, but it's actually the details of yours. How would you tell it in the most loving way possible? So that can be really helpful, right? If I'm going to talk about, you know, my own life and say, well, I didn't do too great. This is all true, by the way. I didn't do too great in high school. And then I kind of, struggled in undergrad and I didn't feel like I was worthy. And, that might be the way you tell your own story. But if you look at it like you're looking at a friend, you might say, I was really overwhelmed by the chaos in my home growing up. And I really struggled with my dad was pretty volatile or his temper was all over the place. And I didn't know how to cope with it. And I didn't have any models for me about how to focus on what I needed to do, but also get my emotional needs met. And that was really difficult. And as a result, my performance in school wasn't so great, right? That's how you might talk in a loving way about your story. And we want you to be doing that here. Okay. So think about, how would I tell this story if it were my bestie? Being vulnerable can be hard, this, but sharing your struggles and being vulnerable is going to make it more impactful, kind of like I just did there, right? It's uncomfortable, but that discomfort is what's going to actually allow the board to see who you are as a human being. Okay, last part about telling your story, and then we're going to wrap it up here. In our experience, persuasive rehabilitation stories have kind of 3 components to them. I actually call this something slightly different sometimes, but on the far left here, we have significant events that have shaped your life. Sometimes I call this the then bucket, back then, okay? I'm going to jump to the far right, which is recognize lessons learned. I'm going to call this the now bucket. And the middle one, identifying your turning points. So what do I mean by that? Back then, what was your life like? How was it difficult? You heard me give some examples, right? Maybe you were living in a family or in a community where poverty was common. People didn't have their basic needs met. And you, your family, your parents were just trying to keep their head above water. And that made it really impossible for you to think about your future. Maybe you or someone in your life, a parent, someone close to you, was struggling with substance use. And that became kind of the only reality that you knew for a while. There's so many other examples I could give, but I want to talk about back then, positive and negative, but especially when you're telling a story of redemption, and it can be easy actually to say, well, I had a pretty good childhood, right? But that's actually not going to give the board context. That may be true in many ways, but you really want to focus on what tripped you up, what made it influenced how the criminal legal involvement came to be. And again, that could be, it could be from your perspective, really the system's fault and not your fault that you came to be involved. But the story that we want you to be focusing on is what was going on then and how is your life different now? Okay. And so jumping again to the recognized lessons learned, how is your life different now? That's really a brag on yourself bucket. Okay. So currently I am in training to become a nurse. I am happily in a relationship or, have been with my current partner for the last 5 years. That was a huge influence. Can brag on your volunteer work, all the stuff that we mentioned earlier, but volunteer work or other positive things going on in your life currently. And the turning point, I think this can be powerful because if you can identify, not everyone has one, but many people, if you stop and think, you might. So turning points that I hear a lot are, I had a kid and I realized I don't want to model for my child what was modeled for me. Or I had a kid and I realized I want better for them than what I had. Or I want to give them the best possible shot of being successful in life. Just one example. Maybe for you instead, the example is I hit a milestone birthday and I realized, I want things to change. So if there's some kind of turning point, that could be something really important to focus on. So how is life then? What was the turning point, if there was one? And what is life like now? I think think we are wrapping up. We're getting ready to wrap up. We want to remind you, first of all, to register for part 2. I think someone's going to stick in the chat the link or the information about part 2 of this training. We really just scratched the surface here. Okay, so you got a lot of great information about how to get ready, get the documents you need, and prepare to start to begin your pardon application. But we want you to come back. Reviewing the application is also going to be important. We walked you through what we think you need, but there's really no substitute for you going and actually looking, right? It's all online, going and looking and saying, okay, this is the way that I'm going to have to talk about my life here. This is, these are the different sections that I'm going to have to complete. Also, begin to organize the necessary information that you need. So we each walked you through some of how you might do that, but going and getting your court documents, starting with that GCIC Purpose Code U, of course, and then getting your court documents and gathering your documents in addition to the court documents, also your personal information. So I do think some of that personal information can actually take a while to get, especially the addresses or the employment or the substance use or treatment documents. And then start taking notes about your story. The storytelling piece is really a creative piece, right? It is, even when we're telling a true story, how we tell it matters a lot. And of course, all of you will be telling a true story, but how you tell it matters. And so start thinking and letting it kick around in your mind. How might I want to talk about this? Talk about how you might discuss it with your friends and loved ones. Okay, so is there anything else from the other presenters that I might have missed, or I want to make sure that we think we're about ready to wrap up, take some questions.
Hi, everyone. My name is Erin Donahue-Keeler. I'm another attorney at the Georgia Justice Project, and I was tasked with sort of throwing back to the panelists today some of the questions or themes that came out as questions in the chat today. So I'm going to try and capture things, but if anybody has questions that are still pending, go ahead and put them in the Q&A box and we'll try to address them now. The first sort of thing that I think we could maybe hit on again is there were several questions about eligibility and what would disqualify someone from being eligible. What a traffic offense? What if somebody's completed part of their sentence but not the whole sentence? So panelists, perhaps you could tackle that one more time.
Perfect. And the slides are up here too. I'm happy to start off. So the biggest rule that we are talking with folks about is the 5 years, right? You have to be off of all sentences for 5 years. So if there is a question about a portion of my sentence is suspended or non-reporting or unsupervised, those all count as portions of the sentence. The sentence must be completely over, done, and closed out for the 5 years to start to run. In terms of the living a law-abiding life, I think that was kind of the other part of the question in there, Erin, about what if I have something else that happens? And our best guidance here is if you have something that is appearing on your criminal history, which usually means it's because there was an arrest and it was a fingerprintable offense. If it is appearing on your criminal history, the board is going to see that too, and that is going to push out the waiting period, meaning it's going to push out the 5 years. The only exception that we're aware of is if it's appearing on your criminal history, is if the case has been completely dismissed and restricted. Other types of traffic violations, I had the example of having a stop sign violation, right? A ticket for that. That doesn't show up on your official criminal history. It's not fingerprintable. So if you have these non-serious traffic offenses that are not resulting in an arrest, that are not showing up on your criminal history, those are the ones that do not impact the 5-year waiting period. I hope that gives a little bit more clarity there. If there are more specific follow-up questions to that, please drop them in the chat. I'm happy to revisit that.
Another theme I think that came up was around background check reports. And so maybe we could talk a little bit about a private background check report versus a GCIC, and maybe touch a little bit on the types of GCIC reports that exist.
Sure. I'm happy to take us out with this one too. Okay, so Brenna talked to everyone about The two-step process for record clearing. I always like to have people associate the two steps together, right? So it's a two-step process to clear someone's record, restriction and sealing. It's two steps because there are two types of backgrounds in Georgia. There is an official background check. This is more like an arrest record and is maintained by the GBI. And then there is a private background check basis that gathers information from what's online and in clerk's offices. So there is official GCIC, and then there is a private background check, which is created by a company, and there are thousands that do this. So two different reports. In either case, an employer can choose to get your permission to pull either. Permission is required, and the consent form should give you an idea of what kind of background check they're going to pull. But if an employer is pulling an official criminal history GCIC background check, they are going to pull what's called a purpose code E for employer. That is going to show any arrest during your adult life that has not been restricted. Anything that has been restricted would not be available to their eyes. That's the whole benefit of doing that first step of the record clearing process. If instead an employer has enlisted a company, let's say backgroundcheck.com or Checker, to pull a private background check, what they are going to do is they're going to set parameters, right? They may only care about 5 years, 10 years, felonies, misdemeanors, or both. They'll set parameters, and they will look at what is publicly available to generate a report and give that to the employer. In that instance, if you have had something that has been sealed, meaning the clerk's file is no longer public record, nothing can show up on that background check if it has been sealed. So cases that have been sealed cannot appear. So there's a little bit more there I think we can talk about as it relates to additional protections and things like the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And let's do that. It's important for folks to know. So the Fair Credit Reporting Act is just federal protections that folks have. And what it does is it put limits on private background checks only. So this only applies to the checkers.com, the assurance companies, right? These types of companies. What it says is that those reports must be accurate, and they cannot report old history if it is a non-conviction. What does that mean for our purposes? On a private background check, they can't report things that are sealed. They can't report things that are inaccurate. It has to be correct. And they can't report things that are dismissed or other types of non-convictions that are over 7 years from arrest. So happy to answer any follow-ups there, or if the team has something to add.
I was just going to jump in to say, I think Brenda mentioned earlier that we have the Georgia Justice Project has a monthly First Friday presentation that will get into a lot more detail about record clearing in general, and what Paige mentioned about the private background checks and fair credit reporting. That, as it may be obvious, but the Fair Credit Reporting Act really doesn't impact or have anything to do with pardons in terms of your record. And what the board can see. Okay, so it is important for record clearing in other situations, but it's not really going to come up in terms of your pardon. So I wouldn't dig in too much, folks, with that, unless you're looking for a different kind of remedy or you have other questions, in which case register for our First Friday. You can email our intake for that.
Yeah, that was a great reminder, Cooper. It also made me think of if there's anyone on this call that's already gotten a pardon, and maybe they've even gotten the case restricted and sealed. What is the impact of that, right? If you have an order that's restricted and sealed the pardon offense, it cannot show up on a purpose code E. It has been restricted, and it cannot show on a private background check. It has been removed from public record, sealed. But Brenda, are you going to add to that?
I was not going to add to that, but I wanted to go back to the first question a little bit, because I know we have some colleagues that are working really hard to make sure everyone knows about the ability to terminate their probation early. So just I wanted to go back to the waiting period and make sure that everyone knows, if you are currently on probation and you meet these 3 criteria, you should be talking to your probation officer about early termination, because even if you were on, and I know I'm repeating what we said before, but I think it's really important. A lot of people think, oh, I'm on non-reporting, so I'm basically done. But the reality is that 5-year clock does not start ticking until your probation is terminated, and non-reporting is not termination. So lots of information on our website and videos and trainings that we've done about that. But in Georgia, we have really long, unnecessarily long, some of us would say, probation sentences that can sometimes be 10 or 15 years. And if you wait until the very end of that, then that means you've got another 5 years to wait before before you can apply for a pardon. So just wanted to make that point again.
And Brenda, if somebody doesn't know if their sentence has been terminated, how can they find that out?
Well, they should reach out to their probation officer, and they should ask for paperwork showing that they've been terminated if they're not sure. And if they can't get in touch with their probation officer, reach out to the supervisor in the office that they were supervised from. And then there's also a DCS hotline and email that you can reach out to generally. I don't know that off the top of my head, but I'll try to get it and drop it in the chat.
Another question that has come up for folks is, does the board really require everyone to provide employment history from the end of their sentence? And I think there's been some understandable frustration expressed that for a lot of people, it's been a really long time since they've been off sentence. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about this in part 2, but just wondering if anybody could address that piece, or maybe a brief preview.
Want to go, Paige? Do you want me to do it? I feel happy either way. Okay. So yeah, I know this was a lot of detail, and I talked about it with the addresses, but not with the employment. All you can do is your best, right? So I made suggestions for how you might jog your own memory, which is, oh, remember Jim that I worked with? I think I have his cell number. Or, you may be able to kind of go back and puzzle it together, which is what we recommend you try to do as much as you can. And also, you're a human being that has a memory that sometimes fails you, and the board does understand that. I think in part 2, they're going to talk about kind of some tips for when that happens. For example, maybe you know that you worked at a place sometime in 2021, but you don't know when. I think they usually recommend putting January 1st for that. Or I think the primary thing is trying not to have as many gaps. Really, it's tune into part 2. They're going to walk you through some more details, but don't run away afraid you can't get a pardon because you've forgotten that one employer in 1997. Like we promise there are people who get pardons that couldn't remember. So just all you can do is your best.
I think those were the main themes that I pulled from the questions that have been asked. Unless anybody else has more.
We had a couple of questions about sort of statistics and what is the likelihood that you are going to get a pardon. And this is something that when we've got a representative from the board, we can dive into a little bit more, and they can be more exact than we can. I mean, I will say this is a very intense and process that requires a lot of information and time to get everything together. So it's a lot of work. We don't want to downplay that. Very roughly, I would say that, probably about 50% of the people that are applying for an actual pardon, who are getting everything in and meeting the criteria, are getting pardons. So compared to other states, that's a pretty high rate. But yeah, it's not a guarantee for sure. But there is a good chance that, and hopefully the process of going through the application is useful to you in other ways, and thinking about how you want to tell your story and getting all that information together so that you'll have it for other purposes as well. So there is value to going through it.
I think the last thing I would add, it's not necessarily responsive to a question, but there's been a lot of resources we've been sharing, and just want to share with the group that our intent, of course, is to share this recording, to share the slides, as well as a kind of focused collection of the handouts and resources that we've dropped in the chat. Once we have had part 2 coming to you all in just a couple of weeks, what we will do is we will send out what we've been calling the resource toolkit, right, which, to everyone so that you have all of it in one place. So our hope for that is to get that to everyone once it's complete, including part 2 of the training, which would be towards the end of the month. So more resources to share. Thank you so much for your time this morning. I don't know if anyone else has anything else to say, but I'm just grateful to share this space with you, and you can do it. We see people doing this all the time. And it's such a worthwhile process to go through now that it opens the door to clearing your records so you can get the things that you deserve. So thank you. Take care.